Hello everyone, and welcome to the 16th part of the extra Q&A in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. With me we have Saif, who is always doing those Q&A videos with me. We will probably take turns in answering your questions, and in any case, if you have any additional ones, feel free to post them down below. If they have not been answered yet, we will surely make a future video about that. But without further ado, I guess we could just start with the first question. And this one is rather interesting, as we get it quite often, as some of the teachers in the broader context of what we try to explain seem to have a lack of joy in their practice. And the question is, can you talk more about the relationship of joy to the path? You want to start, or should I?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I mean, joy is completely and utterly fundamental to the path. I mean, like any full practice that the Buddha outlines, like joy is always that prerequisite for the body becoming tranquil, the mind calming down, becoming concentrated, and then seeing things as they really are. And yeah, even like the Buddha's enlightenment itself, like the way he became enlightened was seeing that there was a joy apart from sensual joy. And then pursuing that gave him the knowledge and vision of how things really are. So it is absolutely fundamental, but as Klaus was like pointing to before, it's not necessarily the same joy that we think of when we think of conventional joy. So for like arhants, for example, who would supposedly be the most joyful in the entire world system, for a normal person looking at them, they might seem a bit joyless, because the joy that they have is the joy of equanimity, and all of those joys that conventionally we might take as joyful. For example, even things like laughter. The Buddha always talks about how like even laughter is sort of too much for an arahant. Like it's going a bit too far. Like his equanimity is already much more calm than that. So you have to be like very discerning, basically, about the type of joy. The Buddha said is the righteous, the wholesome joy that leads to awakening. And you have to really make sure, because if you dive straight into whatever joy you think the Buddha says is the right joy, and it isn't the right joy, then you're going to be increasing the unwholesome qualities. And also, it's not as simple as saying that, like, the Buddha said, oh, sensuality joy is bad, and so then I can just do some meditative joy. But it's not as simple as that, because the Buddha said that not all meditative pleasure is good. So even though like you practice some sort of meditation, and it means that like you are engaging less with sensuality as a result, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the joy that leads to awakening, which is the main thing that you really want if you want to practice towards stream entry and beyond. So what is the joy that the Buddha talked about then? That is apart from sensuality. Well, it's not about meditative versus like joy gained from external means. It's about the joy that the Buddha said was bad, which was unwholesome, which is the joy that is connected with the presence of pleasurable feeling. Because if it's connected with the presence of pleasurable feeling, you have to think like, what is not there right now? And what is not there is unpleasant feeling and neutral feeling, which means that the pleasurable feeling that you're enjoying, the joy that you gain out of it, is completely and utterly finite, and it's actually binding you to the pleasurable feeling and making the unpleasant feeling and the neutral feeling tinged with aversion in the future. And that counts as well, both for like joy that arises from the most coarse sensuality, but also like if your like meditation is about like producing the presence of pleasurable feeling, even if it makes you stop seeking other pleasurable feelings, it's still sort of within that domain, which is why a lot of people can practice this meditative pleasure, but they still don't know the way out of suffering. So you have to learn how to attain that joy that is not connected with pleasurable feeling. And how to do that? Well, you give up craving towards all three feelings, which means that this pleasure that the Buddha is talking about, it's present, even when there's a neutral feeling, even when there's unpleasant feeling. Because as Sariputta said, the pleasure is the pleasure of nothing being felt. It's the pleasure of like whatever feeling is present, you are not affected by it, whether it's pleasurable feeling or neutral feeling or unpleasant feeling. And that's why it's joyful, like in a wholesome way, because it's not underpinned by being bound to one specific feeling. It's about being unbound from every feeling. And it's also why it's the pleasure that's connected with awakening, because as a result, you see the escape from feeling because of this joy. And you see it on this like entire, supra-mundane level of like, whatever, as you're feeling this joy, you can reflect like, whatever feeling comes my way, past, future, present, superior, inferior, I'm not affected by it. And that's how it leads to awakening. That's the pleasure that the Buddha talked about. So yeah, you have to be very discerning about the joy, basically. It's the very special joy that the Buddha talks about.
No. I like to think about the type of joy in terms of relief, really. It's a type of joy that comes out of not being pressured by your feelings anymore. Normally they force you in one direction or another. They force you towards a goal, towards some future thing to attain that gives you joy or something like that. And when that pressure is gone, then you can never be certain until you have attained the right view, but sets a good direction. Like it's a very relieving kind of joy that only gets more neutral over time. Just imagine, I don't know, being oppressed by something, like being very sick, being, I don't know, in a very dangerous situation and then escaping that. It will be a tremendous relief to escape that that situation, but you cannot keep up that pleasure forever. So you will be relieved, but it fizzles out into a neutralness. That is quite pleasant. In fact, it's the most sublime thing, not being pressured at all. So yeah, that is the kind of joy you're aiming for, and not any kind of ecstatic joy or really any kind of joy that comes in whatever you call meditation when it is connected to just the presence of feeling, as Saif said. So that is very important. Yeah, I think it was a very good answer. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess since you said like the pleasure, relief, the Buddha has those like similes about abandoning the hindrances, and they're all literally about relief, like being free from prison, being free from debt, being finding your way out of this endless desert and so on. And it's always about unbinding. It's always about relief, and it's never about the presence of a particular feeling. It's always being withdrawn from it. Yeah. I guess also it's good to mention as well that it needs to be on the level of like your entire existence, basically. Like if that relief is only for an hour while you sit down, then it's finite, and it's not going to be on the level which allows you to know, as the Buddha would talk about, the remainderless fading away and cessation of suffering, which is what you need and what the pleasure is about. So you need to be on the level of like, how am I escaping feeling at the level of my entire existence? And yeah.
That is where the true relief that is connected to Dhamma practice starts. Yeah, that is true. And one more sutta that comes to mind when it comes to the entire topic of feeling and pleasure might be the sutta about the two arrows that the Buddha was giving at some point, where he explains the difference between how an ordinary person feels and how a noble one feels. And the noble one, the one who practices Dhamma rightly, always feels a feeling detached. So whenever there is a pleasant, neutral, or bad feeling, whatever it is, he always feels it detached. And that is a kind of relief-related pleasure and joy that is connected to the path and that will lead to liberation. The other kinds will only strengthen your binding to this world. You always have to come back into the domain of the senses to get more of it. And that is what you try to overcome. Hence you are unbound from that entire domain in the end. Yeah. Anything else, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think we've got enough detail. So let's move on.
Well, it's asked a lot, so. Okay, the next question is as follows. If you practice this non-reactivity style of training, is formal sitting practice a hindrance? And I will answer this one first. It depends on how you do it. There's nothing wrong with sitting. When we try to explain meditation in the way of the suttas, people often have the impression that sitting overall is wrong and that we should not sit any longer. That is not the case. The body has to be in any kind of posture at any given time. And there are convenient postures and not so convenient postures. So lying is not so convenient as it is usually associated with sleeping in the beginning. You can meditate while lying. That's also working to some extent, but it's much more convenient to either sit or to walk. Those are the two most suitable postures for practice, I would say. And so you can sit, but the sitting is more or less a byproduct of the right practice. You don't sit down to practice, you practice, and as a result, you sit because it's convenient. That is maybe a good way of phrasing it, and not the other way around. The sitting is not the setup for the joy that you're about to experience. You just sit because you have to be in some posture, or you walk because you have to be in some posture. So the sitting practice is technically not a hindrance, but you can make a hindrance out of it if you practice a style of meditation that is not very advantageous to Dhamma practice. Yeah, but overall, it can be a hindrance, but it's usually not. Yeah.
Yeah, like you're saying about being a byproduct, that's actually like a lot of the time how it's explained when the Buddha explains the gradual training. Like it starts off with virtue, sense training precepts, moderation, eating, seclusion, and then only after all that, then the Buddha says, then the monk seeks out a secluded dwelling, seeks out, root of a tree and so on. And that's because, like, if you're practicing on the level of like your whole life, like at the beginning, maybe it's at the level of like while you're in the midst of activities and so on. But as a result of the practice, the activities will start to die down. Like you're not engaging with sensuality anymore as a result of your abandonment. You're not engaging with distractions anymore. So like at some point you'll have to contend with, what am I going to do with my time? Am I going to go and pursue a distraction because now I've got nothing to do? Or am I just going to sit down and abide, as the Buddha says, abide with the mind free from sense desires, free from ill will, free from slothful torpor and all this stuff. And then, you just abide like that. And in this sense, it's even more important than how people usually talk about formal sitting practice, because when you talk about it in this way, like it kind of becomes your permanent mode of being. Like if you abandon sensuality at the level of your whole life, like unless you're pursuing, your daily duties and so on, like what do you do except just sit or lie or walk and just dwell with the pure mind, as it is in the suttas. Like they go for their arms round and then they just find a spot to either dwell in jhana, or they got more work to do, pursue more insight and so on. But yeah, it's that becomes your normal mode of being, and you can even start to understand like what entering the stream might mean from this perspective, because like if this like dwelling without sensuality and so on becomes your normal mode of being, then even when you start to leave that, you engage with sensuality, you like become heedless and so on. Okay, that heedlessness will have to have some sort of finitude to it, and when you get exhausted from it, like where did you return to except back to sitting, back to dwelling with the pure mind? And then when you dwell like that, knowledge and vision of things as they really are become more prominent, and then the fetters become even more less binding, and then the practice just keeps speeding up by itself because this is your new default, and you can't really go back to the old way of life anymore. But yeah, it has to be like kind of the level of a byproduct, as in a product of your practice, the level of your entire life. But even if you haven't like completely been accomplished in virtue and sense restraint completely, you can start sitting like straight away. Just like sit for a few hours and just be aware of your intentions. Don't give into sensuality. Don't give into distraction. Don't try to get away from your thoughts. Try to let them abide. But if you're doing it correctly, like you will also be fulfilling all the rest of the practice. Like when you get up, then it should be harder for you to break the virtue. It should be harder for you to go back to sensuality. If you like stand up and then you're like, first thought is let me go like engage with sensuality for 2 hours now, then like the sitting you've been doing hasn't been factually lessening the sensuality. You haven't been doing that work. So like if you practice in this way, you will be completing the full gradual training through it, and you'll know that because again, this sitting will become like more of a permanent mode of being. Because you finish 2 hours of non-reactivity, and then it's like, well, what am I going to do? Go stand up and go back to sensuality? And that's what we've been restraining from. And then you realize, like, oh, this is it. This is me dwelling with a pure mind, and it's not difficult to sit for 12 hours a day because it's genuinely pleasurable. So yeah.
So that's kind of the important point that is sometimes not highlighted enough. The sitting is actually very pleasant, albeit neutral, if you do it with a pure mind. The only thing that makes the sitting and doing nothing at all otherwise unpleasant is craving. And when there is no craving present or anything that is related to the sensual domain or anything really, then it's just nice to sit like that. The only reason that is not the most pleasant thing imaginable is craving. Yeah.
That's why like the translation of like jhana is like absorption. It's not a bad one because that's kind of what it's like. Not in terms of being absorbed in an object, but when you're free from craving, like you get absorbed in that state because you don't want to go back to sensuality. Like it's pleasurable. You become absorbed in it, and it becomes harder to engage with sensuality than to just sit there for 12 hours a day completely effortlessly. And yeah,
you don't want to go back anymore. There's resistance, some at least, towards going back, towards engaging sensually at least. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else, or should we move on?
Yeah, unless you have any other thoughts, we can move on.
Then let's move on. Okay, the next question is a bit longer, and the person in question says, I have spent many, many years contemplating Nagarjunas. I can't pronounce that word, so I will not even try. Fundamentals of the middle way. Are you convinced that Nagarjuna's premise of emptiness is rooted in the Buddha's authentic teachings? Also, do you conclude that the realization of emptiness leads to nirvana? And luckily that question is for you, because I probably couldn't have answered this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated and big question because it's one of the most debated disciples of the Buddha. I'm of the opinion that is like it's fairly legit in the sense that the things that he says are like too subtle to be something being said from someone who hasn't understood the middle way, as in, you know, this text especially is all about going beyond this polarity of existence and non-existence, which the Buddha says that's what dependent origination is. That being said, there's a difference between like someone being like sort of accurate and it being useful, because I don't think reading him is very useful, to be honest, especially this specific text, because I mean the main thing is that it's first of all it's very complicated the way he says things. Second of all, there are expressions that he uses that sometimes go a bit too far, as in like when he says, for example, that there's not even a single gap between samsara and nibbana. You know, maybe for an arahant that could make sort of some sense, but you know, anyone that's like just at the beginning of the practice reads that, they're just going to be like, oh yeah, samsara is fine, craving is fine, it's, you know, craving is nibbana, and so on. These sorts of things are really difficult to pick up in accurate way, and also there's just no practical teachings in there. And the things that he's saying about dependent origination are things that can only be understood through practice, through the whole gradual training. So if you want to learn the cessation of views that he's talking about, well, reading about all the way that these are wrong views, well, they can work to some extent, but to understand dependent origination and learn the cessation of views, understand what emptiness means in your own experience, you have to be virtuous, you have to have sense restraint, moderation in eating, you have to be mindfulness, clear comprehension, seclusion, abandon the hindrances, attain jhana, develop insight into dependent origination, and then it will come to you. And then if you do that, you have no need of Nagarjuna's text or anything he said, because you have it in your own experience. And if you don't have it in your own experience, like, none of his texts can help you because they don't have any practical instructions. So while I think he's fairly accurate in all the things he says, it's better to just read the suttas, which are much more practical and which have much more like accurate expressions. Yeah, so that's pretty much it, I would say.
Maybe one more remark that I find very useful when it comes to pretty much any teaching. The person who is striving towards the right view or towards Nibbana needs instructions and not knowledge. So you need to understand what to do to get there. It will not help you to attain some kind of knowledge about wrong views or whatever. You literally just need to do the right things. And for that you need to know, at least get an inkling of what the right things are. And that is on a very practical level. It must be very pragmatic, it must be very understandable, very direct, and not complicated or complex or any of that. Then you can be quite... Then it's at least a good sign that it might be a good teaching. And that is exactly what the suttas provide, which is why we encourage them so much.
Yeah. I mean, you can like literally contemplate these things for years and years and years on end, but without like suitable basis of restraint and withdrawal and concentration, none of it will have basis to take root. And if you have that basis, then that you don't need any much more than that. You don't need much like extraordinary teachings. You need like a few accurate words to see correctly, and that's really it. Yeah, even Nagarjuna also has like other texts that are more practical, but even then it's like normally like restatements of things in their suttas in much more like shorthand form. So even then it would be better to just go read the suttas and get in much more extended format.
Yeah, that's kind of how it is. Yeah, anyway, anything else on Nagarjuna? I think I can't even pronounce his name right.
I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly either.
Okay.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's it. Yeah. I mean, I think to extend, I mean, this is kind of our position probably, I would say, on any like extra like teacher that comes down the line, is that probably there are some that are more accurate than others, some that are less accurate, but overall, like the sutras are supreme here. And yeah.
And in the end, it doesn't really matter. Once you have attained the right view, you put your face explicitly in the Buddha and can take no other teacher than the Buddha. So yeah. And that's quite accurate from my opinion, at least, or from my point of view. You literally put faith in the Buddha and not in secondary teachers or anyone else anymore, because we know for fact that he was right.
Yeah. That's how you become independent of any teachers, because you know that what you know now is what the Buddha actually taught, and what the Buddha actually taught is the way that you become completely independent of anything ever, pretty much.
And also teachers.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move to the next question. And this one is a little bit shorter. And the person in question wants to know, how should I interpret the Kalama Sutta? And for that, you probably need a bit more context, as not everyone will be familiar with the Kalama Sutta. I think in this sutta, the Buddha is visiting a rather remote village that has been frequently visited by ascetics from all kinds of schools, and each of them has taught something different. and sometimes they were contradicting each other. And then the Buddha came along and they wanted to know from him, yeah, but how do we know whom to trust? Whom should we put our faith in? And then the Buddha pretty much gives them a lecture that they, what they must do to see for themselves. And in the end, he pretty much says that you must do the gradual training. You must actually be virtuous, all the other things that are part of that, and then you will see for yourself. That is kind of the essence of it. And in the end, there's a very famous statement that pretty much says, do not go by hearsay, do not go by tradition, do not go by the reputation of another, do not do this, do not do that. In the end, it is only about direct knowing and seeing. As in, you must attain the vision of the Dhamma, you must understand dependent origination, you must attain the right view. Otherwise, you cannot really understand what the Buddha is talking about. And when you have done that, you will see that all the other views that all the other teachers were proclaiming are wrong. And very likely you will also understand why they are wrong. So yeah, that is more or less a summary of the sutta, if I remember it correctly. Please correct me if I don't. But yeah, so in the end, the core message of it is that none of those things, no logical reasoning, none of that is a replacement for direct knowing and seeing, for realizing the truth of dependent origination. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, and it came to the last question. That's why you become independent of any teachers, because when you know it in your own experience, that becomes your guide then. And no external authority can ever shake you ever again. Yeah, I guess one popular sort of misinterpretation of the sutta is that sometimes one can go a bit too far in interpreting what the Buddha is saying. Because what he says is like, don't go by hearsay, don't go by authority and so on. Only when it's that it's blameless, that it's wholesome, then you should go for it. And that can be misinterpreted to say that we should abandon authority, abandon scripture, abandon everything, and then just go by my own sense of right and wrong. If I don't agree with the Buddha, I can just reject this and so on. I mean, you have to sort of balance it with the other things the Buddha says in the suttas, because one of the massive things that's needed for practice is both faith and the utterance of another. So at the beginning, especially, that external authority is absolutely necessary. It's just that you should not take the external authority as correct simply because, this contemplative is our teacher. It's correct because if I follow it, then I get the personal knowledge where I go beyond every teacher. And also, it's you have to be accurate also when the Buddha talks about wholesome and unwholesome. You have to understand that wholesome means leading to the ultimate liberation. It does not mean lessening suffering. So if I practice something in my experience and it leads to less suffering, and it could be the most extraordinary lessening of suffering, like 4 years of depression is completely gone, just completely happy life. And one shouldn't disregard that. I mean, it's incredible stuff. But it does not necessarily mean that it's wholesome in the same way that the Buddha is talking about it, in terms of leading to the ultimate liberation. And that division should be made if one wants to go towards stream entry and above. So you have to realize that when the Buddha says you should only go when it's wholesome and all of that, it means that you should not be content with lessening of suffering. You should only be content when you know for sure that this leads to the ultimate liberation. And yeah, that's how you should consider different interpretations of the Dhamma and so on. You should not be content until you know for yourself that it's the ultimate liberation. Yeah, it's a good marker, because the nature of the ultimate liberation is completely universal. That's why the Buddha says that's a good measuring stick, because lessening suffering is always relative. It can be done in multitude of ways. Some person might take this drug, some person might do this exercise routine, some person might do specific meditation, and it helps them particularly in this unique way. But the ultimate liberation is universal, because the ultimate liberation is nibbana, which is the undetermined, literally the thing that is like the least particularized, the freedom from all particular phenomena. And how could there be anything except universal? That's why the Buddha always says that, like, understanding the Dhamma comes with this inferential knowledge that, people who came to this knowledge in the past, people who came to cessation of suffering in the past, future, present, they all came to it in exactly the way I know now. And that's why it's a good measuring stick, because if you get that knowledge, you know it's the right thing, because you know it's the universal way of suffering. And that's exactly what it teaches in the Sutta. It teaches greed, aversion, delusion. Those are the unwholesome. Those are the things that bind you to samsara. Giving them up, you reach the universal liberation. And yeah, that's all I want to exemplify, is that it needs to be a level of ultimate liberation to go beyond doubt, and not just lessening of suffering.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, taking some drug also liberates you from suffering for a time, at least from the point of view of an ordinary person. It does factually reduce suffering right here and now, but it's not the right kind of liberation, let's put it like that. And yeah, one must always be very careful not to fall into such traps that might be better than what you know, but they are not the ultimate yet, and you have no real metric for the ultimate, because whenever you attain something that is better than everything you know, then it is the most sublime thing for you, and you cannot really know if there's more to be attained, unless you have attained the right view. Then you know, okay, this is the real deal, and there's no more to be attained after this. That's kind of also what the lion's roar of every arahant contains. There's no more to be done. The person has gone beyond training, and now they are finished. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good interpretation of the Kalama Sutta. It does not mean that you should ignore the suttas if they do not suit you. It just means that you should be very careful in what you hear. That's maybe a good way of phrasing it. Mm-hmm. You can practice after a teacher for a time, but you should always keep in mind, until you have confirmed what the suttas say pretty much, that those teachers could also be wrong. Do what they say if they sound authentic, but if it's not giving you the result and you have been training rightly, then by all means go look somewhere else. Yeah, okay. I think the recording time for this video is coming to an end. I always cannot read the number at the top of the screen because it's too small, but I think it's about 3 minutes left. So I think it's a good time to make a stop here. I hope you have all enjoyed the questions and especially the answers that we have given you. Maybe we have cleared up some doubt for you. If not, by all means, put your additional remarks about the questions down in the comments. Yeah, but until then, we wish you a pleasant day, and maybe until next time. Goodbye.